Hi everyone. This week we're going to take a look at a very interesting topic. It's something that fascinates me greatly. When did the Trojan War really take place? Now we're going to look at a particular aspect of this question. Many people claim that the Trojan War took place in about 1200 BCE. Now that was the end of the Mycenaean Era, also the Bronze Age. Now many people claim, in support of this, that Homer's Iliad contains descriptions of things which best fit the Mycenaean era. Basically, details that were remembered from the Mycenaean era that made their way into the Iliad. Now obviously, if these details are genuine recollections of the Mycenaean era, then that would be strong evidence that the Trojan War really took place in that era, so that would fit the traditional date of about 1200 BCE. So let's take a look at this in more detail though, because a lot of things might seem convincing on a surface level observation, but it's good to look deeper into a subject than just the surface level. So first off, let's talk about the metal used, or the metal described often by Homer. Now he describes many of the weapons being used by the Greeks and the Trojans as being bronze. Now obviously, that seems to fit the Bronze Age, when bronze was used, hence the name of the age, the Bronze Age, because when Homer was writing, it was the Iron Age, so weapons were generally made out of iron. But let's stop and think about this, rather than just rashly jumping to the conclusion that that means the Trojan War took place in the Bronze Age. Let's look at the rest of the details that Homer provides. It's true that he does claim that many of the weapons were made out of bronze, but he also claims that many of the weapons were made out of other metals like silver, gold, or even tin, and they don't fit any historical era. There was no historical era when the Greeks or the Trojans made weapons out of gold or tin or silver. So the fact that he refers to bronze is not necessarily any more historically significant than the fact he refers to gold, silver, and tin. In fact, when you look at it in context, the references to bronze are probably just for the same reason as the references to the other metals. In other words, they're just fantastical details. They're not historical details, that they're not reflective of any historical period. So when we look at it in context, we see that actually there's no reason to base any historical conclusions on the fact that Homer refers to bronze as a metal being used to make the weapons. In fact, we would expect weapons to maybe be exaggerated in their glory, and so we might expect these glorious metals being used, being referred to in the Iliad, like bronze and gold, etc. But tools are not the sort of thing that you would expect to be exaggerated. And the tools in the Iliad are described as being made of iron, not bronze. So that indicates that actually Homer's describing the Iron Age, not the Bronze Age. Now another example of this, of a supposed detail in the Iliad that fits the Mycenaean era, are some of the designs of the weapons. So for example, some of the spears, are described as being very, very long. Now, they're described as being so long that they seem to fit the thrusting spears used in the Mycenaean era. They weren't used in later Greek times. The Mycenaeans had these very long spears which enabled them to stand very far back from their enemy, so they could thrust at them, hence the name. So Homer's references to these very long spears seems to fit that historical aspect of the Mycenaean era. But wait, let's think about this in context, in the context of everything else Homer describes. He describes his characters as engaging in superhuman feats, like sometimes a character might throw an entire boulder with one hand, and other things like that. The heroes of the Iliad are not just regular people, they are described in a superhuman context. So the fact that they're described as having these weapons which are enormous, well, we can just take it in the same well, when we take it in the same context as the rest of the Iliad, with the characters being described in these superhuman ways, and, like I mentioned before, the weapons themselves being made out of fantastical metals that were never used in any historical era, it becomes clear that the references to these large weapons, like enormously long spears, are just another manifestation of Homer describing his heroes in superhuman terms. We find another example of this in reference to a particular shield that Homer refers to. Now, when he refers to the shape of the shields that the Greeks used, he always refers to them as being circular. However, on one particular occasion, he refers to a character having a shield that went down to his feet. Now, if you think about that, a circular shield that went down to your feet would end up being so wide that you wouldn't be able to use it, really, in real life. It would be too impractical. It would just get in your way. You wouldn't really be able to fight in front of you. It wouldn't be practical, and no shield in history has ever been that large if it's a circle. So because of that, some people, or many people, claim that this is actually a reference to a tower shield, not a circular shield, but a tower shield. Now, tower shields were used in Mycenaean times. But again, let's wait. Let's think about this. Does this really make sense? Well, again, when we think about it in the context of everything else, the context of Homer describing his characters in these superhuman terms, and him describing the weapons as being made out of all these glorious but completely historically inaccurate metals, and the very large spear and everything, it becomes clear that really this large circular shield actually makes perfect sense in the context of the Iliad. It fits in with the way that Homer describes his heroes, not as regular people who would be impeded by a circular shield that large, but as amazing superhuman characters who have these enormous shields and these weapons made out of gold and silver, etc. So, in the context of the Iliad, there's no actual reason to conclude that this reference to a shield extending down to the feet is a reference to a tower shield. Another example, though, of a detail from the Mycenaean era, which supposedly is found in the Iliad, is the fact that Agamemnon, the leader of the Greek army, is described as the king of Mycenae. Now that's obviously significant because Mycenae was the most prominent city the most prominent city-state in the Mycenaean era. That's why the Mycenaean era is called what it is, because the Mycenaeans were the most prominent of all the Greeks at that time. So that seems to fit in with Agamemnon being the king of Mycenae. However, again, let's stop and think about this. Think about what Homer actually describes. It's true that he refers to Mycenae a few times, but he doesn't refer to it a lot. He refers to it a handful of times, and only twice in reference to Agamemnon. Far, far more times than that, he refers to Agamemnon's kingdom as being Argos, not Mycenae. Now Argos was a city-state just next to Mycenae, so there's clearly a connection. Argos, though, is not a geographical term. The Argolis is the geographical term for the region in which Argos and Mycenae and other city-states were located. But Argos is not a geographical term. It's a term referring to the city or the city-state. So the fact that Homer repeatedly calls Agamemnon's kingdom the kingdom of Argos rather than the kingdom of Mycenae indicates that actually Argos was the prominent, dominant city-state at that time. It's true Homer calls Agamemnon the king of Mycenae once or twice, but the fact that his kingdom is repeatedly referred to as the kingdom of Argos indicates that, okay, well, maybe Mycenae was the city that Agamemnon lived in, perhaps, but his kingdom was the kingdom of Argos. Argos was the city-state that was dominant. And so that, again, is not a match for the Mycenaean era, but is a match for later times. Now, another thing is that it's true that Mycenae is referred to in the Iliad as being a well-built citadel. Was Mycenae still around in later times when Argos was prominent? Well, yes, it was. In fact, at around the time that Argos became prominent in Greece, Mycenae actually had reconstruction work done on its grand city walls. The grand city walls, by the way, were its Bronze Age city walls, which were far bigger than the city walls of the newer Greek cities that had been built after the Mycenaean era. So in comparison to all of them, the city of Mycenae would have seemed incredibly well fortified, even though it wasn't actually as powerful as it had been in the Mycenaean era. So the reference in the Iliad to Mycenae being a well-built citadel is absolutely appropriate for later times in the Iron Age. So, in conclusion, we can see that although there are a number of references that seem to be reflections of the Mycenaean era, actually they can be understood perfectly well in the context of the Iron Age, in the context of the way Homer was actually describing things in the Iliad, not in terms of perfect historical accuracy, but in many cases in fantastical superhuman terms. And in the case of Mycenae, we see that actually Agamemnon's kingdom is described repeatedly as the kingdom of Argos, indicating that it was actually Argos, the city-state, which was dominant, although Agamemnon may have lived in Mycenae. So really, we see that an Iron Age setting is more appropriate for the Iliad rather than a Bronze Age or Mycenaean era setting.